Hey guys, tonight we're exploring how the American housewife disappeared in just one generation. And before we begin, please subscribe to the channel if you enjoy relaxing history stories for sleep. Imagine waking up on a quiet suburban street in America in the year 1955. The sun is just beginning to rise above rows of nearly identical houses. A woman steps into her kitchen before anyone else is awake. She starts the coffee, prepares breakfast, and begins planning the day. For millions of American women, this was not unusual. It was considered normal life. In fact, many people believed it was the ideal life. After World War II, the United States experienced a period of economic growth unlike anything it had seen before. Families moved into new suburban neighborhoods, bought modern appliances, and dreamed of stability. The image of the happy housewife became one of the most recognizable symbols of the era. Advertisements showed smiling women proudly standing beside washing machines, ovens, and refrigerators. Magazines described homemaking as a woman's greatest purpose. Television programs often portrayed wives as cheerful caretakers, whose lives revolved around their husbands and children. To many outsiders, it looked like a perfect system. The husband earned the money while the wife managed the home. Yet beneath the polished image, reality was often far more complicated. Many women spent long days performing repetitive tasks with little recognition. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, shopping, and childcare filled nearly every hour. Although new household appliances promised to reduce work, they often raised expectations instead. Homes were expected to be cleaner than ever before. Meals were expected to be more elaborate. Children were expected to receive constant attention. Some women found fulfillment in this role, but others quietly felt trapped. They had dreams that stretched beyond the walls of their homes. Higher education was becoming more accessible. Yet many women were encouraged to leave school once they found a husband. A successful marriage was often seen as more important than a successful career. For a time, few people openly questioned these expectations. But change was already beginning. As the 1960s approached, economic pressures slowly increased. More families discovered that a single income was no longer enough to provide the lifestyle they wanted. At the same time, more women started attending colleges and universities. They gained skills, confidence, and opportunities that previous generations rarely had. New conversations about equality began spreading across the country. Ideas that once seemed radical gradually entered everyday discussions. Young women started asking questions that their mothers had often kept to themselves. Why should their choices be limited? Why should their futures depend entirely on marriage? Why couldn't they pursue careers while also having families? The answers would transform American society in ways few people could have imagined. Within only a few decades, the traditional image of the stay-at-home wife would begin to fade, replaced by a completely different vision of family life. As the 1960s continued, the world around American women began changing faster than ever before. The generation that had grown up during the comfortable post-war years was now entering adulthood. Many young women looked at the lives of their mothers and wondered if there might be something more. They appreciated the sacrifices their mothers had made, but they were not always eager to repeat the same path. Universities saw growing numbers of female students. Employers slowly opened doors that had previously been reserved almost entirely for men. For the first time, large numbers of women could realistically imagine careers that lasted longer than a few years before marriage. This shift did not happen overnight. In many communities, traditional expectations remained powerful. A woman who chose work over homemaking could face criticism from neighbours, friends, and even relatives. Yet the tide was turning. One important factor was education. College campuses became places where new ideas spread rapidly. Women studied law, science, business, and journalism. They met professors and classmates who encouraged them to think differently about their futures. At the same time, books and articles began challenging long-held assumptions about family life. Some writers argued that many housewives felt isolated, despite living in comfortable homes. They described a quiet dissatisfaction that could not be solved with a newer washing machine or a larger kitchen. These arguments sparked intense debates across the nation. Another major change involved technology and medicine. Reliable birth control gave many women greater control over when they would start families. Decisions that had once seemed unavoidable suddenly became choices. This allowed some women to focus on education and careers before becoming mothers. Meanwhile, employers were searching for workers in a growing economy. Businesses, schools, hospitals, and offices increasingly hired women. Every year, more families became accustomed to the idea of wives earning paychecks. Economic reality also played a role. Inflation gradually reduced the power of a single income. The suburban dream that had seemed affordable in the 1950s became more expensive. Families wanted larger homes, newer cars, and better opportunities for their children. A second income could make these goals easier to achieve. What began as a necessity for some households eventually became normal for millions. By the early 1970s, the image of the perfect stay-at-home wife no longer dominated American culture the way it once had. Television shows, advertisements, and newspapers reflected a society in transition. Women were becoming doctors, lawyers, teachers, managers, and business owners in greater numbers than ever before. The transformation was far from complete, and many challenges remained. But the foundation of American family life had already begun to shift in a historic way. By the late 1970s, the change was impossible to ignore. Across America, more married women were working than ever before. Office buildings that had once been filled mostly with men now employed growing numbers of women. Schools, hospitals, banks, and government agencies relied heavily on female workers. The traditional family model had not disappeared completely, but it was no longer the only path society considered acceptable. For many women, earning their own income brought a sense of independence that previous generations rarely experienced. They could make financial decisions, build careers, and develop identities beyond the role of wife or mother. Yet this new freedom often came with unexpected difficulties. Many women discovered that entering the workforce did not remove their responsibilities at home. After finishing a full day at work, they still returned home to cook meals, clean the house, and care for children. Researchers later called this the second shift. While society had changed, household expectations often changed more slowly. Husbands and wives had to negotiate new roles within their families. Some adapted successfully, while others struggled with the transition. The economy continued pushing families toward dual incomes. During the 1970s and 1980s, rising housing prices and living costs made it harder for a single paycheck to support a household. What had once been a choice increasingly became a necessity. Young couples entering adulthood often assumed that both partners would work. Children who grew up during this era viewed working mothers as normal rather than unusual. Popular culture reflected these changes as well. Movies and television programs began featuring women with careers, ambitions, and goals outside the home. Advertisements no longer focused exclusively on housewives, cleaning kitchens or serving dinner. Companies recognized that women were becoming major consumers and professionals. Political changes also contributed to the transformation. Laws aimed at reducing workplace discrimination created new opportunities. Although inequalities remained, barriers that had restricted women for generations slowly weakened. Each small victory encouraged more women to pursue careers that had once seemed impossible. By the end of the 20th century, the classic image of the American housewife from the 1950s felt increasingly distant. The neat suburban woman smiling beside her washing machine had become more of a cultural memory than a common reality. Yet the story was not simply about one role disappearing. It was about millions of women gaining the ability to choose different paths. Some still preferred staying home to raise children. Others pursued careers. Many attempted to balance both worlds at the same time. The greatest change was that these decisions were increasingly viewed as personal, choices rather than obligations, imposed by society. The America that emerged looked very different from the nation that had celebrated the ideal housewife. Only a few decades earlier, as the 21st century began, many Americans looked back at the 1950s with a sense of nostalgia. Old photographs showed tidy neighborhoods, polished cars, and smiling families gathered around dinner tables. To some people, happier time. But historians often remind us that memories can be selective. The image of the perfect housewife was partly a cultural ideal rather than a complete picture of reality. Even during the height of the housewife era, millions of women worked outside the home. Many families, especially those with lower incomes, depended on women's earnings long before society openly acknowledged it. The difference was that their stories were often overlooked. As decades passed, researchers interviewed women who had lived through those years. Their experiences varied greatly. Some remembered their homemaking years with pride and satisfaction. They enjoyed raising children, building communities, and creating stable homes. Others recalled feelings of loneliness and frustration. They described spending long hours, isolated from adult conversation, while carrying enormous responsibilities. These different experiences revealed an important truth. There had never been a single universal experience of being an American housewife. The role meant different things to different people. By the early 2000s, technology transformed family life once again. Computers, smartphones, and the internet changed how people worked and communicated. Some parents began working remotely from home. Online shopping reduced time spent running errands. New services made daily tasks easier than previous generations could have imagined. Yet modern families also faced new pressures. Work often followed people home through emails and mobile devices. Balancing careers and family responsibilities remained a challenge. Interestingly, debates about homemaking never completely disappeared. Some people argued that society had undervalued the work performed inside the home. Raising children, managing households, and caring for family members still required enormous effort. Whether those tasks were performed by women or men, others emphasized the importance of economic independence and career opportunities. The discussion evolved, but the central question remained surprisingly familiar. How should families divide their responsibilities? And what creates the best life for parents and children? Today, the answer varies from household to household. Some families have one stay-at-home parent. Others have two working parents. Many use a combination of different arrangements throughout their lives. What would have seemed unusual in 1955 is now completely ordinary. The disappearance of the traditional American housewife was not caused by a single event or a single movement. It resulted from countless economic, social, cultural, and technological changes occurring over many decades. Together, those forces reshaped the lives of millions of women and transformed the structure of American families in one of the most significant social changes of the modern era. By the 2020s, the world that had created the classic American housewife was almost unrecognizable. A family living in a suburban home might still share some similarities with a family from 1955, but their daily routines were dramatically different. Many households relied on incomes. Women occupied leadership positions in business, government, medicine, science, and countless other professions. Young girls grew up seeing possibilities that their grandmothers could scarcely imagine. Yet history has a funny way of repeating itself. In recent years, social media platforms have sparked renewed interest in traditional homemaking. Videos showing baking, gardening, decorating, and family-centered lifestyles gained millions of views. Some women proudly embraced the role of stay-at-home mothers and homemakers. Others preferred careers outside the home. What surprised many observers was that these choices were no longer viewed as mutually exclusive. A woman could build a career, raise children, start a business, or move between different roles during different stages of life. The freedom to choose became one of the most important legacies of the changes that began decades earlier. Historians often point out that the disappearance of the traditional housewife does not mean homemaking itself vanished. Homes still need to be managed. Children still need care and guidance. Meals still need to be prepared. The difference is that these responsibilities are now distributed in many different ways. In some families, mothers handle most of them. In others, fathers take the lead. Many couples share the workload together. Looking back, the rise and decline of the American housewife tells a larger story about how societies evolve, economic conditions change, technology advances. Cultural values shift. New Opportunities appear while old. Expectations fade. What once seemed permanent can transform. Within a single generation, the smiling housewife of the 1950s remains one of the most recognizable symbols in American history, not because her role survived unchanged, but because it reminds us how quickly everyday life can be, reshaped by forces that few people fully understand while they are living through them at and for millions of women. That transformation changed not only their futures, but the future of America itself. Yet there is another reason the story of the American housewife remains so fascinating. It was never simply about work or money. It was also about identity. For generations, people were taught that a successful life followed a specific path. Men were expected to provide. Women were expected to nurture. Entire communities were built around these assumptions. Schools, churches, businesses, and even advertisements reinforced them every day. When those expectations began to change, many people felt uncertain about what the future would look like. Some welcomed the changes with excitement. Others worried that something valuable was being lost. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, newspapers frequently published articles asking whether modern families were better off than previous generations. The answers were rarely simple. Families had more opportunities, but they also faced new pressures. Parents often spent long hours at work. Commuting consumed valuable time. Childcare became a major expense for many households. Some people looked back at the 1950s and imagined a golden age of stability. Others remembered the limitations that many women faced during that era and had no desire to return to it. The truth, as historians often note, lies somewhere in the middle. Every generation gains certain advantages while losing others. The housewife generation enjoyed stronger community connections in some neighborhoods, but fewer personal choices. Later generations gained freedom and opportunity, but often lived with greater financial and social pressures. One of the most surprising developments was the growing recognition that unpaid household labour had enormous economic value. For decades, cooking meals, raising children, caring for elderly relatives, cleaning homes, and managing family schedules were often taken for granted because no paycheck was attached to them. Economists eventually began estimating what these tasks would cost if families hired professionals to perform them. The numbers were staggering. The work traditionally done by homemakers represented thousands of hours and enormous financial value. This realization led many people to view the contributions of past housewives with new respect, rather than seeing them as women who simply stayed home. Historians increasingly recognized them as managers, caregivers, planners, teachers, and organizers whose efforts helped build entire communities. In a sense, the American housewife never truly disappeared. The title changed, the expectations changed, and society changed, but the essential work of caring for families remained. The difference is that today those responsibilities are shared and organized in far more diverse ways than anyone in 1955 could have imagined, and as future generations look back on our own era, they may discover that the choices we consider normal today are only another chapter in a story that is still being written as historians continued studying the 20th century. They noticed something interesting. The image most people remember of the American housewife was actually based on a relatively short period of history. Popular culture often makes it seem as though women had always lived that way. But that was not true. Before the Second World War, many women worked on farms, helped run family businesses, took in cleaned houses, or worked in factories and shops. During the war itself, millions of women entered the workforce while men served overseas. They built airplanes, manufactured equipment, and kept industries running. When the war ended, society encouraged many of them to return home. But the experience had already changed expectations forever. Women had proven that they could succeed in virtually every type of work. That memory never completely disappeared. As the decades passed, daughters and granddaughters inherited the opportunities created by those earlier generations. The result was a society that became increasingly difficult to fit into old categories. By the early 21st century, the question was no longer whether women should work. Instead, people discussed how families could balance work, childcare, education, and personal happiness. Governments, businesses, and communities all searched for solutions. Some companies introduced flexible schedules. Others offered parental leave programs. Schools expanded after-school activities to help working parents. Each generation attempted to adapt to changing realities. Yet despite all these changes, one thing remained remarkably consistent. Most people still wanted the same basic goals that families had pursued in the 1950s. They wanted security. They wanted meaningful relationships. They wanted healthy children and comfortable homes. The methods changed, but the hopes often remained the same. This is one reason the story of the American housewife continues to capture people's attention. It is not simply a story about women. It is a story about family, work, expectations, and the constant struggle to create a good life in a changing world. Every photograph of a smiling suburban mother, every advertisement promising domestic happiness, and every debate about careers and family reflects larger questions about what people value most. Looking back today, it is easy to assume the outcome was inevitable. But for the people living through those decades, nothing felt certain. They could not see the future. They could not know how dramatically society would transform. They were simply making decisions based on the opportunities and challenges of their own time, and through millions of individual choices made over many decades, America gradually moved from a nation where the stay-at-home housewife represented the ideal to a nation where families could define success in countless different ways. The journey was complicated, sometimes controversial, and often unexpected. But it became one of the most significant social transformations in modern American history. By the time the children of the 1950s became grandparents themselves, many were amazed by how much had changed within a single lifetime. A woman born in 1940 could remember a childhood when most mothers in her neighbourhood stayed home she could also live long enough to see women become airline pilots, military commanders, university presidents, and leaders of major corporations. Few social changes in American history happen so quickly or affected so many lives. Yet every transformation creates new questions. As women gained greater access to careers, society began debating how work should fit into family life. Parents often struggled to balance professional responsibilities with raising children. Some families found creative solutions. Grandparents helped with childcare. Flexible work schedules became more common. Technology allowed certain jobs to be performed from home. Still, many people felt there was never enough time. Ironically, some modern families discovered that despite having more conveniences than ever before, they often felt busier than previous generations. A washing machine that once saved hours of labour could not create more hours in the day. Smartphones connected people instantly, but also made it harder to fully disconnect from work. The challenges were different, but they remain challenges nonetheless. Historians often caution against viewing the past through either perfect nostalgia or harsh criticism. The world of the 1950s was neither paradise nor prison. For some women, homemaking brought deep satisfaction and a strong sense of purpose. For others, it felt restrictive and frustrating. Likewise, modern life offers freedoms and opportunities that previous generations never enjoyed. But it also introduces stresses they rarely faced. Understanding history means recognizing both sides of the story. The disappearance of the traditional housewife was not a simple victory or a simple loss. It was a complex transformation shaped by economics, technology, culture, education, and individual choice. Millions of women contributed to that change, often in small ways that seemed insignificant at the time. A young woman deciding to attend college, a mother returning to work after raising children, a family choosing to rely on to incomes, a company hiring women into positions previously reserved for men. Each decision added another piece to a much larger picture. Looking back now, it becomes clear that history is rarely driven by a single dramatic event. More often, it changes because ordinary people gradually alter how they live their daily lives. The story of the American housewife is one of the clearest examples of that process. What began as the dominant ideal of one era slowly evolved into something entirely different, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape families, careers, and expectations even today. As the years passed, the image of the traditional American housewife slowly moved from everyday reality into the pages of history books. Younger generations often saw old photographs and wondered what life had truly been like behind those carefully posed smiles. Historians searched through diaries, letters, newspaper articles, and interviews to find the answer. What they discovered was a world far more complicated than the advertisements had suggested. Many women took pride in creating warm homes and raising families. They were having school events and evenings when entire families sat together for dinner. Communities were often tightly connected, and people frequently knew their neighbours well. At the same time, many women spoke about sacrifices that were rarely acknowledged. Some had given up dreams of becoming teachers, writers, doctors. or artists because society expected them to follow a different path. Others struggled with financial dependence, knowing that their futures were tied almost entirely to their husbands' incomes. These stories revealed that history is rarely as simple as it appears from a distance. By the beginning of the 21st century, many Americans had grandparents who experienced both worlds. They remembered a society where women were expected to stay home, and they also witnessed a society where women could pursue nearly any profession. Their lives formed a bridge between two very different eras. Researchers studying family life noticed another important trend. Although the structure of households had changed, many of the values people cared about remained remarkably similar. Parents still wanted their children to succeed. Families still searched for stability and security. Communities still looked for ways to support one another. The goals often stayed the same, even when the methods changed. In many ways, the debate surrounding the housewife never truly ended. Instead, it evolved into broader conversations about work-life balance, childcare, personal fulfillment, and economic opportunity. Some people argued that modern society placed too much emphasis on careers. Others believed that expanding opportunities had improved life for millions. Most families found themselves somewhere between these positions, adapting to circumstances as best they could. The story of the American housewife ultimately reminds us that social roles are not fixed forever. They change as economies grow, technologies advance, and cultural attitudes evolve. What one generation considers normal may seem unusual to the next. The women who lived through these changes often had no idea they were participating in one of the largest social transformations in American history. They were simply making choices for themselves and their families. Yet those countless individual decisions reshaped an entire nation, proving that history is often written not only by famous leaders and major events, but also by ordinary people living their everyday lives. Perhaps the most surprising part of this story is that there was never a single moment when the American housewife disappeared. No law was passed. No official announcement was made. There was no day when people woke up and suddenly realized that an era had ended. Instead, the change happened quietly. One family decided that the wife would return to work. Another family delayed having children while pursuing education. A young girl watched her mother balance both a career and a household and imagined a different future for herself. Small decisions accumulated year after year until the entire social landscape looked different. This gradual transformation makes the story difficult to notice. While it is happening, people living through the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s often focused on their immediate concerns rather than on the larger historical shift unfolding around them. They worried about paying bills, raising children, finding jobs, and planning for retirement. Only later did historians step back and recognize how dramatically society had changed. By then, the traditional housewife had become more of a cultural symbol than a common reality. Old television shows, magazine covers, and advertisements preserved the image for future generations. These artifacts became windows into a different world. They showed neatly dressed women serving dinner, caring for children, and managing spotless homes. Yet they also reflected the expectations and limitations of their time. Modern viewers often interpret these images in very different ways. Some see comfort, stability, and community. Others see restricted opportunities and rigid social roles. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. History rarely fits neatly into simple categories. The reality was always more complicated than the stereotypes. One lesson from this story is that societies are constantly evolving. Customs that seem permanent can change surprisingly quickly. New technologies create opportunities that previous generations could never imagine. Economic shifts alter family structures. Cultural values adapt to new circumstances. People adjust often without realizing they are helping shape the future. The women who lived through the rise and decline of the housewife era did exactly that. Through their choices, struggles, successes, and sacrifices, they helped redefine what women could achieve and how families could function. Their experiences influenced laws, workplaces, schools, and communities across the country. Even today, their legacy remains visible in everyday life. Whenever people discuss careers, parenting, household responsibilities, or personal freedom, they are often continuing conversations that began decades ago. The story may focus on housewives, but at its heart it is really about change itself. It is about how ordinary people respond when the world around them transforms, and how their individual decisions eventually become history. And yet, despite all the changes, one question continues to appear whenever people discuss the past. Were families happier during the age of the American housewife? Historians have spent years trying to answer that question. But the truth is difficult to measure. Happiness does not leave behind clear records. Census reports can count jobs and incomes, but they cannot easily measure satisfaction, love, or personal fulfillment. Some women looked back on their years as homemakers with fond memories. They remembered watching their children grow up, building strong friendships within their communities, and creating homes that served as the centre of family life. Others remembered feeling isolated and limited by expectations they never chose for themselves. The same era could feel completely different depending on the person experiencing it. This is one reason the story remains so relevant today. Modern families continue facing many of the same challenges. Even if the circumstances have changed, parents still worry about balancing work and family. Couples still negotiate responsibilities at home. People still search for meaningful lives that provide both security and purpose. The details may be different, but the underlying questions remain remarkably familiar. When future historians study our own time, they may be surprised by aspects of modern life that we consider ordinary, just as we look back at the 1950s and see a world that feels distant. Future generations may look at our era with the same curiosity. They may wonder why people spent so much time online, why work followed employees home through digital devices, or why families organised their lives the way they did. History has a way of turning everyday routines into fascinating mysteries. The rise and decline of the American housewife serves as a reminder that no social system lasts forever. Every generation inherits traditions from the past, modifies them, and passes something new to the future. The women who lived through this transformation were not simply witnesses to history. They were active participants in it. Through millions of personal decisions, they helped reshape American society and redefine what women, families, and communities could become. Their story remains one of the most remarkable examples of how ordinary lives can quietly change the course of history. Perhaps the final lesson of this story is that history is rarely about winners and losers. It is tempting to look at the past and decide that one way of life was better than another. But real life is usually far more complicated. The women of the 1950s lived in a world shaped by the values, opportunities, and limitations of their time. Many worked incredibly hard to build stable homes and support their families. Their contributions often went unnoticed because they took place behind front doors, rather than in offices or public institutions. Yet those contributions helped create the prosperous communities that defined post-war America. At the same time, the generations that followed pushed for greater opportunities and broader choices. They challenged assumptions that had existed for decades. They entered professions that previous generations could only dream about. They changed workplaces, universities, and governments. Their efforts expanded possibilities not only for women, but for future generations as well. Neither group erased the other. Instead, each generation added a new chapter to the story. Today, when people look at old photographs of smiling housewives standing in spotless kitchens, they are often seeing more than just individuals. They are seeing a symbol of a particular moment in history. A moment when America believed it had found the perfect formula for family life. But history teaches us that no formula remains unchanged forever. Society continues to evolve because people themselves continue to evolve. New challenges appear. New opportunities emerge. Old traditions are questioned while new traditions take shape. The story of the American housewife is therefore not really about a role disappearing. It is about a society adapting to change. The kitchens, neighbourhoods, and family rooms of the 1950s may seem distant now, but the people who lived there faced many of the same hopes and fears that people experience today. They worried about money, relationships, children, and the future. They tried to build meaningful lives with the choices available to them. Inte zenze they were from us at all. And as we quietly bring this chapter of history to a close, it is worth remembering that future. Generations will one day examine our own lives with the same curiosity. They will study our customs, our careers, our technologies, and our families. They will ask why we lived the way we did. Just as we search for answers in the past, they will search for answers in us. And that endless conversation between generations is what makes history so fascinating, because every ending eventually becomes the beginning of another story. As the memories of the housewife era slowly faded, they were replaced by stories. Grandchildren listened as grandparents described a world without smartphones, internet connections, or even many of the conveniences people now take for granted. They spoke about handwritten grocery lists, neighbourhood gatherings, and evenings spent together rather than staring at screens. Some remembered the period with warmth. Others remembered its challenges. Together, these memories created a more complete picture than any advertisement or television show ever could. One of the reasons this chapter of history remains so popular is because it touches on something universal. Every generation wonders whether life was better in the past. Every generation imagines that previous eras were either simpler or harder than the present. The truth is usually a mixture of both. The 1950s offered a sense of stability that many people admired, but they also contained limitations that many people wanted to overcome. Modern life provides freedoms and opportunities that earlier generations could hardly imagine, but it also introduces new pressures and uncertainties. History reminds us that every era involves trade-offs. Researchers who study family life often emphasize that the concept of the ideal family has changed repeatedly throughout history. The stay-at-home housewife was only one model among many. Before industrialization, entire families often worked together on farms. During periods of economic hardship, nearly everyone who could work contributed financially. In different cultures and different centuries, family responsibilities have been divided in countless ways. What seems normal at one moment in history can appear unusual just a few decades later. The story of the American housewife also demonstrates how quickly social expectations can change. A young woman graduating from high school in 1955 was likely given advice very different from the advice offered to a young woman graduating today. The goals, opportunities, and assumptions surrounding her future would have been shaped by an entirely different world. Yet neither generation could fully predict what lay ahead. History is filled with surprises. People make plans based on the realities they know, only to discover that society evolves in unexpected directions. Perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate. It is not merely about housewives, careers, or family structures. It is about adaptation. It is about how ordinary people respond when the world changes around them. Some embrace change quickly. Others resist it. Most simply do their best to adjust while caring for the people they love. The women who lived through this transformation did exactly that. Without realizing it, they helped shape a new version of America. One that would look dramatically different from the nation they inherited as children. And their influence can still be felt in countless homes, workplaces, and communities across the country today. By the middle of the 21st century, the housewife of the 1950s had become almost a historical character, someone people recognized from old photographs, movies, and television reruns. Yet her influence never truly disappeared. Many traditions that originated during that era continued, shaping family life long after the role itself became less common. Holiday celebrations, neighborhood activities, family dinners, and countless household customs were passed from one generation to the next. Even people who had never met a traditional housewife often inherited habits and values that could be traced back to that period. Historians sometimes compare social change to the movement of a river. At first, the water appears calm and the landscape seems permanent, but over time a current slowly shapes everything around it. The transformation of American family life followed a similar pattern. Decade after decade, small adjustments accumulated. A woman accepted a promotion. A father became more involved in childcare. A couple divided household responsibilities differently than their parents had. None of these choices seemed revolutionary on their own. Yet together they altered the direction of society. What makes this story particularly remarkable is how ordinary it was. Unlike wars, elections, or famous speeches, the decline of the traditional housewife happened mostly in kitchens, living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces. It unfolded through private conversations and personal decisions. Most of the people involved never imagined they were participating in a major historical shift. They were simply trying to build better lives for themselves and their families. As researchers continued examining this period, they found that many assumptions about the past were overly simplistic. The image of the perfectly happy housewife and the image of the completely unhappy housewife were both incomplete. Real people lived somewhere between those extremes. Some loved the role. Some disliked it. Many experienced both satisfaction and frustration at different times. Human lives are rarely as simple as cultural stereotypes suggest in the end. The story of the American housewife reveals something important about history itself. Every generation inherits a set of expectations about how life should be lived. Some of those expectations survive. Others gradually disappear. New ideas replace old ones, and the cycle continues. What feels permanent today may seem temporary tomorrow. The families of the 1950s could not fully imagine the world we live in now, just as we cannot fully imagine the world future generations will create, and perhaps that is the most fascinating part of all. History is not only a record of what happened, it is a reminder that change is always taking place, even when we cannot see it. The women whose lives shaped this story may never have expected to become part of a larger historical narrative, yet their experiences helped transform an entire nation through countless ordinary decisions. They left a legacy that continues to influence American life to this very day. There is one final detail that often surprises people when they learn about this period of American history. The housewife was not only a social role, she was also a powerful economic force. Advertisers, manufacturers, and businesses spent billions of dollars trying to understand what homemakers wanted. Companies knew that many household purchasing decisions were made by women. Everything from food products to furniture, clothing, cleaning supplies, and home appliances was marketed directly to them. In many ways, the American economy depended on their choices. A new refrigerator, a washing machine, or a vacuum cleaner was not simply a product. It was sold as a promise of a better life. Advertisements claimed these inventions would save time, reduce stress, and create happier families. Yet an interesting paradox emerged. As technology made household tasks easier, expectations often grew higher. A family that once considered a weekly cleaning acceptable might begin, expecting spotless rooms every day. Meals became more elaborate. Standards for parenting increased. The amount of work changed. But the pressure to maintain a perfect home often remained. Some historians argue that modern appliances reduced physical labour while simultaneously increasing social expectations. In other words, convenience did not always create more free time. As the decades passed and more women entered the workforce, companies adapted once again. Products were redesigned for busy families. Restaurants expanded takeout options. Childcare services became more common. Employers adjusted policies to attract working women. Entire industries evolved in response to changing family structures. This demonstrates how one social transformation can influence countless other parts of society. When family life changes, businesses, schools, governments, and communities change with it. Looking back now, it becomes clear that the decline of the traditional American housewife was connected to much larger historical forces. Economic growth, technological innovation, educational opportunities, cultural movements, and shifting values all worked together. No single cause can fully explain what happened. Instead, it was the result of many developments occurring at the same time. That complexity is what makes the story so fascinating for historians. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect is that the women who lived through these changes rarely viewed themselves as historical figures. Most were focused on everyday concerns. They worried about paying bills, preparing meals, helping children with homework, and planning for the future. Yet history is often shaped by people who never expect to appear in history books. Their daily decisions gradually influence entire societies. The story of the American housewife is a perfect example of that process. It shows how ordinary lives can create extraordinary change, leaving an impact that continues long after the world that produced them has disappeared. Another reason this history matters is because it helps explain the America we see today. Many modern debates about careers, childcare, education, and family responsibilities can be traced back to changes that began during the decline of the housewife era. Questions that seem modern often have roots reaching decades into the past. How much time should parents spend with their children? How should household duties be divided? Is financial success more important than personal fulfillment? These discussions did not suddenly appear in recent years. They evolved gradually as society transformed. During the late 20th century, researchers noticed that younger generations often had very different expectations from their grandparents. A girl growing up in 1955 might have been asked what kind of husband she hoped to marry. A girl growing up in 1995 was more likely to be asked what career she wanted to pursue. This shift may seem simple, but it represented a profound change in how society viewed women's futures. Opportunities that once seemed unusual became increasingly normal. Universities, workplaces, and professional organizations adjusted to these new realities. At the same time, many people continued to admire aspects of traditional homemaking. Skills such as cooking, gardening, sewing, and caring for a household never disappeared completely. In fact, some experienced periods of renewed popularity. Families often discovered that even in a rapidly changing world, certain traditions still provided comfort and stability. The difference was that these activities were increasingly viewed as personal choices, rather than social obligations. Historians sometimes describe this transformation as a movement from expectation to choice. In the 1950s, many women felt that society expected them to become housewives whether they wanted to or not. By the early 21st century, women had a far wider range of options. Some chose careers. Some chose homemaking. Many combined both at different stages of life. The important difference was the ability to decide for themselves. This change was not always easy. Every new freedom brought new responsibilities. Every opportunity created new challenges. Families had to navigate unfamiliar situations and create new traditions. Yet that process of adaptation is one of the defining characteristics of human history. Societies survive because people learn, adjust, and find new ways forward. When future generations look back at the story of the American housewife, they may see more than a discussion about family roles. They may see a lesson about how cultures evolve. They may see how economic forces, technology, education, and individual choices can combine to reshape an entire nation. Most importantly, they may remember that history is not only made by presidents, inventors, or famous leaders. It is also made by millions of ordinary people whose daily decisions quietly change the world around them, one generation at a time. As this chapter of history moves closer to the present day, it becomes easier to see how deeply it affected everyday life. The disappearance of the traditional American housewife was not just about women entering the workforce. It changed neighborhoods, schools, businesses, and even the design of homes. In the 1950s, many suburban communities were built around the assumption that mothers would be at home during the day. School schedules, local events, and community organizations often relied on their participation. As more women began working outside the home, these institutions gradually adapted. After-school programs expanded. Childcare services became more common. Communities reorganized themselves around a new reality. Businesses noticed these changes as well. Grocery stores extended their hours to accommodate working families. Restaurants offered more convenient meal options. Manufacturers developed products aimed at saving time for busy households. Entire industries grew because family routines were changing. What started as personal decisions made by individual families eventually influenced the broader economy. This is one reason historians consider the decline of the housewife era such a significant social transformation. Its effects reached far beyond the walls of the family home. Interestingly, many surveys conducted over the years revealed that people often valued both independence and family life at the same time. They did not necessarily see these goals as opposites. Many women wanted successful careers while also maintaining close relationships with their children. Many men wanted to spend more time with their families than previous generations had. As a result, family roles continued evolving. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the old boundaries became less rigid. Responsibilities that had once been assigned almost exclusively to one parent were increasingly shared. Yet despite all these changes, some aspects of human nature remained constant. People still searched for belonging. They still wanted meaningful relationships. They still hoped to provide better lives for their children. The tools, opportunities, and expectations changed, but these basic desires endured. This continuity helps explain why the story of the American housewife remains relevant. It is not simply about a vanished lifestyle. It is about universal questions concerning purpose, responsibility, and happiness. When historians examine major social changes, they often look for dramatic turning points. But the decline of the traditional housewife reminds us that history can also move quietly. Small decisions repeated millions of times can transform a society just as powerfully as major political events. A woman accepting a job offer, a couple deciding to share household duties, a daughter choosing a different future from her mother. Each choice seemed personal, yet together they reshaped an entire nation. And that is perhaps the most remarkable lesson of all. History is often written not by extraordinary moments, but by ordinary people living ordinary lives. Perhaps the greatest irony in this story is that many of the goals people pursued never actually changed. Whether someone lived in 1955 or 2025, most families wanted security, comfort, opportunity, and a sense of purpose. The methods used to achieve those goals evolved, but the goals themselves remained surprisingly similar. The housewife era and the modern era may appear very different on the surface, yet both were shaped by people trying to create the best possible future for themselves and their children. As historians look back, they often caution against judging the past too harshly. The women who became housewives were responding to the realities of their own time. Many genuinely believed they were building the ideal life. Likewise, the women who pursued careers in later decades were responding to a different set of opportunities and challenges. Neither group possessed a perfect understanding of the future. They simply made choices based on the world they knew. One reason this topic remains fascinating is because it highlights how quickly cultural expectations can shift. A social role that once seemed permanent can become uncommon within only a few generations. Ideas that once appeared unquestionable can be debated and redefined. History constantly reminds us that society is never standing still. Even when change feels slow, it is often happening beneath the surface. Today, the traditional American housewife survives mostly as a symbol of a particular era. She appears in documentaries, old photographs, vintage advertisements, and nostalgic television programs. Yet behind that symbol were real women with unique personalities, ambitions, struggles, and dreams. Some loved the life they built. Some wished for different opportunities. Most experienced a mixture of both joys and frustrations, just like people do today. In the end, the story of the American housewife is not really about disappearance. It is about transformation. The role changed because the world around it changed. New technologies emerged. Economic conditions shifted. Educational opportunities expanded. Social expectations evolved. Together, these forces reshaped everyday life in ways few people could have predicted. And so, as we quietly leave behind the kitchens, neighbourhoods, and family rooms of mid-century America, we are reminded of a simple truth. History is never frozen in place. Every generation inherits a world created by those who came before, then slowly reshapes it for those who will come after. The American housewife was one chapter in that endless story, a chapter that may have ended, but whose influence can still be felt in countless ways today. By the early decades of the 21st century, many Americans found themselves looking back at the housewife era with curiosity. Some viewed it as a time of stronger communities and simpler routines. Others saw it as a period when many women had fewer choices about the direction of their lives. What makes the topic so interesting is that both views contain elements of truth. History is rarely completely good or completely bad. Instead, it is usually a mixture of opportunities and limitations that vary from person to person. The more historians studied the lives of ordinary women, the more they realized how diverse their experiences had been. Two housewives living on the same street could have felt entirely differently about their roles. One might have felt proud and fulfilled, while the other felt restless and constrained. Human experiences are shaped by personality, family circumstances, finances, health, and countless other factors. Because of this, no single story can represent every woman who lived during that era. Another important lesson from this: history is that social. Change often takes longer than people expect. The image of the traditional housewife may have faded, but debates about family responsibilities never disappeared. Parents today still discuss childcare, household duties, and work-life balance. Couples still negotiate how responsibilities should be shared. These conversations have changed form, but they continue reflecting many of the same concerns that existed decades ago. In many ways, the story of the American housewife is really the story of adaptation. Families adjusted to economic pressures. Women adapted to new opportunities. Businesses adapted to changing consumer habits. Schools adapted to new family structures. Each adjustment influenced the next, creating a chain reaction that gradually transformed society. Looking back, the process seems obvious. Living through it, however, was far more uncertain. Perhaps that is why this chapter of history continues to fascinate people around the world. It shows how quickly everyday life can change. It reminds us that customs often feel permanent until they are replaced by something new. Most importantly, it demonstrates that ordinary people have tremendous power to shape the future, even when they do not realize it. Through millions of personal choices made across many decades, American families created a new social reality, one very different from the world their parents and grandparents once believed would last forever. As we move further away from the era of the traditional American housewife, it becomes easier to understand why the topic continues to attract so much attention. The story is not simply about women staying at home or entering the workforce. It is about one of the most dramatic shifts in everyday life that modern America ever experienced. Unlike wars or political revolutions, this transformation happened quietly inside millions of households. It occurred around kitchen tables, in school meetings, during family discussions, and through personal decisions that rarely appeared in newspaper headlines. One fascinating aspect of this change is how different generations viewed success. In the 1950s, success for many women was often defined by creating a happy home, raising children, and supporting a husband's career. Society celebrated these achievements and encouraged women to pursue them. By contrast, later generations expanded the definition of success. A woman could still choose homemaking, but she could also become an engineer, lawyer, scientist, entrepreneur, or anything else she desired. Success became less about following a single path and more about having the freedom to choose among many paths. This shift influenced children as well. Daughters grew up seeing possibilities that their mothers and grandmothers never had. Sons grew up in households where family roles were becoming more flexible. As these children became adults, they carried new expectations into their own families. In this way, change spread naturally from one generation to the next. Historians often note that every major social transformation creates both opportunities and challenges. Greater freedom brought greater responsibility. More career options created new pressures. Families had to find ways to balance work, relationships, and personal goals. There were no perfect solutions, only different approaches. Some succeeded better than others, but nearly everyone was adapting to a world that looked increasingly different from the one that existed only a few decades earlier. Today, when people see vintage photographs of smiling women standing in bright suburban kitchens, they are looking at a snapshot of a specific historical moment. Those images capture a society that believed it had discovered the ideal way to organise family life. Yet history teaches us that no social arrangement remains unchanged forever. Economic conditions shift. Technology advances. Cultural values evolve. What seems permanent in one era can become temporary in the next. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. The story of the American housewife reminds us that history is not made only by famous leaders or extraordinary events. It is also made by ordinary people making everyday choices. Millions of women, each living their own unique lives, helped reshape American society through decisions that often seemed small at the time. Together, those choices created a transformation so significant that it changed the course of modern history and continues to influence family life even today. Even now, the legacy of the American housewife can be found in places where people rarely think to look. Many traditions surrounding holidays, family, school events, and home life were shaped during the decades when homemakers played a central role in community life. Neighbourhood associations, parent-teacher groups, charity events, and local social clubs often depended heavily on women who dedicated large portions of their time to these activities. Their efforts helped create the sense of community that many people still remember when discussing mid-century America. As society changed, these responsibilities did not disappear. Instead, they were redistributed and reorganized. Working parents found new ways to participate in their communities. Schools developed different support systems. Technology made communication faster and more convenient. Yet the need for involvement, cooperation, and community remained. Human beings continued searching for connection, just as they always had. The story also reveals something important about historical memory. People often remember the past through symbols. The American cowboy symbolizes the frontier. The factory worker symbolizes industrial growth. In a similar way, the smiling suburban housewife became a symbol of post-war America. Symbols are powerful because they simplify complex realities. However, they can also hide important details. Behind every famous image were real individuals whose experiences were far more varied than any stereotype could capture. For some women, Homemaking provided meaning, stability, and fulfillment. For others, it felt restrictive, most likely experienced moments of both. That complexity is what makes history so interesting. Real life rarely fits neatly into simple categories. People adapt to their circumstances, pursue their goals, and make the best decisions they can with the information available to them. When historians examine the rise and decline of the American housewife, they are ultimately studying how societies respond to change. New technologies alter daily routines. Economic shifts create different opportunities. Cultural values evolve from one generation to the next. Through it all, ordinary people continue building families, raising children, and planning for the future. The women who lived through this transformation may never have imagined that future generations would study their lives. Yet their experiences became part of a much larger story about freedom, responsibility, opportunity, and adaptation. Their choices helped shape the modern world in countless visible and invisible ways. And as long as people continue asking how family life changes over time, the story of the American housewife will remain an important and fascinating chapter in the history of the United States. By the end of the story, it becomes clear that the American housewife was never simply a person performing household chores. She represented an entire era, a set of expectations, and a vision of what society believed family life should look like. For a period of time, that vision seemed permanent. Politicians praised it. Advertisers promoted it. Television programs celebrated it. Millions of families organised their lives around it. Yet history has shown again and again that even the most widely accepted ideas can change. One of the most remarkable aspects of this transformation is how peaceful it was compared with many other historical changes. There was no single battle, revolution, or dramatic event that ended the housewife era. Instead, change happened through education, economic growth, technological advancement, and personal decisions. A daughter chose college. A wife accepted a job offer. A husband shared more household responsibilities. Employers opened opportunities to women. Little by little, these decisions accumulated until society looked entirely different. As the decades passed, people began viewing family life less as a fixed formula and more as a collection of choices. Some families continued following traditional arrangements. Others experimented with new ones. What mattered increasingly was not whether a family matched a particular ideal, but whether it found a structure that worked for its members. This flexibility became one of the defining features of modern life. Looking back, the traditional American housewife remains one of the most recognizable figures in 20th century history. Her image appears in museums, documentaries, photographs, and history books. Yet the real significance of her story lies not in nostalgia, but in what it teaches us about change. It reminds us that social roles are created by people and can be reshaped by people. It reminds us that expectations that seem natural today may appear very different to future generations. Most importantly, it reminds us that history is constantly moving forward, even when daily life feels ordinary. The women who lived through this period were not trying to become historical figures. They were simply raising children, managing households, pursuing careers, supporting families, and making decisions they believed were best. Yet together, their actions helped transform an entire nation. Their experiences influenced workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, and cultural values across America. And so the story of the American housewife is ultimately a story about ordinary people changing the world without realizing it. It is a story about adaptation, opportunity, and the passage of time. The kitchens may have changed. The expectations may have changed. And society may have changed. But the human desire to build a meaningful life has remained the same. Perhaps the most enduring reason this story continues to capture people's attention is because it forces us to think about how quickly life can change. A woman born in 1930 could have spent her childhood in a world where most mothers died home, reached adulthood during a period that celebrated homemaking as the ideal, and then lived long enough to witness women becoming leaders in nearly every profession imaginable. Few generations in history experienced such dramatic social change within a single lifetime. This transformation also reminds us that history is often far less predictable than it appears in hindsight. Looking back, it may seem obvious that more women would enter universities and workplaces as opportunities expanded. But for people living in the 1950s, the future was uncertain. Many genuinely believed the traditional housewife model would remain the foundation of American society for generations. They could not foresee the technological innovations, economic shifts, and cultural changes that would reshape everyday life. One lesson historians frequently emphasize is that every generation tends to assume its way of life is normal and permanent. Yet history repeatedly proves otherwise. The customs people consider natural are often products of specific circumstances. When those circumstances change, society changes as well. So rise officer? American housewife was shaped by the unique conditions of the post-war era. Her decline was shaped by a different set of conditions that emerged in the decades that followed. Neither outcome was inevitable. Both were responses to the world people were living in at the time. Today, family life in America exists in many different forms. Some households have a stay-at-home parent. Others have two working parents. Some parents work remotely from home. Others balance multiple jobs. There is no longer a single model that dominates society in the way the housewife ideal once did. Instead, families adapt according to their needs, values, and circumstances. In many ways, this diversity of choices may be the most important legacy of the entire transformation. The story began with a society that strongly encouraged one path. It evolved into a society where multiple paths became possible. While debates about family roles continue, the range of options available today would have seemed extraordinary. Too many people living in the middle of the 20th century. As we reflect on the journey of the American housewife, we are reminded that history is not just about institutions or governments. It is about ordinary people making decisions every day. Those decisions may seem small in the moment, but over time they accumulate into powerful forces that reshape nations. The women who lived through this era may not have, realized they were helping create a new chapter in American history, yet their lives became part of a transformation that continues to influence the world today. Another fascinating aspect of this story is how differently each generation interpreted the same events. A grandmother who spent her life as a homemaker might look back with pride, believing she contributed to her family through sacrifice and dedication. Her daughter might remember watching that hard work and deciding she wanted a different future. Her granddaughter might grow up believing she should have the freedom to choose either path. None of these perspectives are necessarily right or wrong. They simply reflect the changing realities of different eras. Historians often describe this process as a conversation between generations. Each generation inherits traditions from the people who came before. Some traditions are preserved, others are modified. A few disappear entirely. The story of the American housewife fits perfectly into this pattern. The role did not vanish because people suddenly rejected the past. Instead, society gradually adjusted to new opportunities and new challenges. Families responded to changing economic conditions. Educational institutions opened more doors. Businesses adapted to a workforce that looked very different from previous generations. One reason the transformation feels so significant is because it occurred during a period when the United States was becoming one of the most influential nations in the world. American movies, television programs, advertisements, and magazines spread images of family life across the globe. For many people outside the United States, the smiling suburban housewife became one of the most recognizable symbols of American culture. As America changed, that image changed as well. The transformation influenced not only American society, but also conversations taking place in many other countries. Today, when people study this era, they often discover that the reality was far more complicated than the stereotypes. The famous image of the cheerful homemaker represented only one part of a much larger story. Behind every photograph was a real person with ambitions, fears, responsibilities, and dreams. Some women found happiness in homemaking. Others sought fulfillment through careers. Many combined different roles throughout their lives. Human experiences were always more diverse than the cultural images suggested. Perhaps that is why the story remains relevant. It reminds us to look beyond simple labels and understand the complexity of real lives. History is filled with people whose experiences cannot be neatly summarized. The American housewife was not merely a symbol. She was a mother, a wife, a neighbor, a volunteer, a caregiver, and often the person who held an entire family together. Whether society celebrated or overlooked her work, its impact was undeniable. As the decades continue to pass, the world of the 1950s grows more distant. Yet the questions raised by that era remain surprisingly familiar. How should people balance work and family? What creates a meaningful life? How do societies adapt to change? These questions have no final answers, which is why the story continues to resonate long after the era itself has passed into history. By the end of the 20th century, many Americans no longer viewed the traditional housewife as the default future for young women. Instead, it became one possible path among many. This shift may sound simple, but it represented a profound change in how society thought about opportunity. For decades, success had often been defined in relatively narrow terms. Over time, that definition expanded. Women were increasingly encouraged to pursue education, careers, creative ambitions, public service, or homemaking depending on their personal goals. Choice became one of the defining values of the modern era. At the same time, many people began re-evaluating the contributions of homemakers. Historians, economists, and social researchers pointed out that caring for children, maintaining households, and supporting families required enormous amounts of time, skill, and effort. Although this work often went unpaid, its importance was impossible to ignore. Communities depended on it. Families depended on it. Future generations depended on it. As a result, the role of the housewife started receiving a different kind of recognition than it had in previous decades. The story also reveals how closely family life is connected to larger historical forces. When economies change, families change. When technology changes, daily routines change. When education expands, expectations change. Individual choices may seem personal, but they are often influenced by broader developments occurring throughout society. The decline of the American housewife illustrates this relationship perfectly. It was not caused by one event or one decision. It emerged from countless changes happening at the same time. Perhaps that is why this history remains so compelling. It is both deeply personal and deeply historical. It involves ordinary people living ordinary lives. Yet their experiences helped reshape an entire nation. The women at the centre of this story were not famous politicians or business leaders. Most never expected anyone to study their lives decades later. Yet their decisions influenced workplaces, schools, neighbourhoods, and cultural expectations across America. As we continue exploring the past, the story of the American housewife serves as a reminder that history is not only made in government buildings or on battlefields. It is also made in kitchens, living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces. It is made whenever people adapt to changing circumstances and imagine new possibilities for the future. And in that sense, the legacy of the American housewife extends far beyond her own era, continuing to shape discussions about family, work, and opportunity even today. Yet, even after all the statistics, studies, and historical debates, the story ultimately comes down to individual lives. Behind every trend was a real person making difficult choices. A young woman deciding whether to attend college. A mother wondering if she should return to work. A family trying to balance financial security with time spent together. These decisions rarely felt historic at the moment they were made. They felt personal. Yet when millions of people faced similar choices, the cumulative effect transformed an entire society. One of the most valuable lessons from this period is that change often happens gradually, enough that people barely notice it. A family adjusts its routine. A workplace hires more women. A school encourages new opportunities. Year by year, these small developments seem ordinary. Only when people compare one generation to another do they realise How much has changed? The America of 2000 looked dramatically different from the America of 1950, even though no single event was responsible for the transformation. The housewife era also reminds us that every generation faces its own challenges. The women of the 1950s dealt with expectations that modern generations may find restrictive. Modern families face pressures that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Different problems replace old ones. Different opportunities replace old limitations. History rarely moves in a straight line toward perfection. Instead, societies constantly adapt to new circumstances. For historians, this is what makes the subject so fascinating. The story is not really about whether one era was better than another. It is about understanding how people respond to changing conditions. It is about recognizing that every generation believes its way of life is normal, only to discover later that it was part of a temporary moment in history. The housewife of the 1950s, once considered the model for the future, eventually became a symbol of the past. Yet symbols can never fully capture real lives. The women who lived through this era were far more than stereotypes from advertisements or television programs. They were individuals with hopes, fears, talents, and ambitions. Some embraced the role society offered them. Others challenged it. Most simply tried to build good lives for themselves and their families. And perhaps that is the most human part of the entire story. Regardless of the decade, people continue searching for purpose, stability, love, and opportunity. The details change from one generation to the next, but those desires remain remarkably constant. In Sense, the women who lived through the rise and decline of the American housewife era were participating in the same timeless struggle that has shaped human history for centuries. The effort to create a meaningful life in a world that never stops changing. As historians continue examining this remarkable period, they often arrive at the same conclusion. The story of the American housewife is really a story about possibility. It shows how quickly expectations can change when society changes. A role that once seemed permanent gradually became optional. A future that once appeared fixed became flexible. New opportunities emerged, and millions of people adjusted their lives accordingly. What makes this transformation especially interesting is that it never completely erased the past. Many traditions from the housewife era survived long after the era itself faded. Family dinners, holiday gatherings, community events, and countless household customs continued to be passed down from generation to generation. The world changed, but pieces of the old world remained. History often works this way. New ideas rarely replace old ones entirely. Instead, they blend together, creating something different from either the past or the present alone. By the time historians began interviewing women who had lived through these decades, many expressed mixed feelings about the changes they witnessed. Some were proud that younger generations had more freedom and opportunity. Others missed aspects of the communities they remembered from their youth. Many felt both emotions at the same time. Their memories remind us that historical change is rarely simple. Progress in one area may create new challenges in another. Gains often come with trade-offs. Understanding history means recognizing these complexities rather than searching for easy answers. The rise and decline of the American housewife also demonstrates how powerful ordinary decisions can be. Most of the women involved were not famous. Their names never appeared in history books. They did not lead movements or hold public office. Yet their choices influenced the direction of society, just as surely as many political last did. By deciding how to live, work, study, raise families, and pursue their goals, they collectively reshaped the future. Today, the image of the 1950s housewife remains one of the most recognizable symbols of American history. Yet the real story is much larger than the image itself. It is a story about families adapting to change. It is a story about expanding opportunities and evolving expectations. Most of all, it is a story about people navigating an uncertain future without knowing how significant their choices would become. And perhaps that is the final lesson. History is not created only by extraordinary individuals. It is created every day by ordinary people making decisions about their own lives. The women who lived through the housewife era could not know that future generations would study their experiences. They were simply trying to build meaningful lives in the world they inherited. Yet through those efforts, they became part of one of the most important social transformations in modern American history. A transformation whose effects can still be seen all around us today. As the years continue to pass, the story of the American housewife becomes less about a specific role and more about a broader lesson in human history. Every generation inherits a set of expectations about what a successful life should look like. Those expectations influence education, careers, relationships, and family decisions. Yet history repeatedly shows that such expectations are never permanent. They evolve alongside the societies that create them. The housewife ideal of the 1950s seemed deeply rooted and widely accepted, but within only a few decades, it had been transformed by forces that many people never anticipated. One reason this change happened so effectively is because it was driven by millions of individuals. Rather than a single authority, people responded to new opportunities as they appeared. They adjusted to economic realities. They pursued goals that previous generations might not have considered possible. Over time, these personal decisions accumulated into a larger social movement. Historians often describe this as one of the most powerful forms of change because it emerges naturally from everyday life rather than being imposed from above. Looking back, it is easy to focus on statistics showing workforce participation, educational achievement, or income levels. Those numbers are important, but they do not fully capture the human side of the story. Behind every statistic was a person making choices about their future. Some decisions were exciting. Others were difficult. Many involved balancing competing responsibilities. Families navigated uncertainty while trying to create stability for the next generation. In doing so, they helped shape a new version of American society. The story also reminds us that cultural ideals can be surprisingly fragile. What one generation celebrates as the perfect lifestyle may be questioned by the next. This does not necessarily mean one generation is wiser than another. More often, it reflects changing circumstances. Different times create different needs. People adapt accordingly. The women of the housewife era were responding to the realities of their world, just as later generations responded to theirs. Today, the image of the American housewife survives mostly through photographs, films, advertisements, and personal memories. Yet the questions raised by her story remain very much alive. How should people balance work and family? What responsibilities should be shared within a household? What does a fulfilling life look like? These questions continue to shape modern discussions because they touch on universal human concerns. And so, the story of the American housewife remains more than a chapter from the past. It serves as a reminder that society is always changing, often in ways that seem invisible while they are happening. Ordinary people adapt, make choices, and pursue their hopes for the future. Only later do historians look back and realise that those ordinary choices helped transform an entire nation. By studying the rise and decline of the American housewife, we begin to understand an important truth about history. Most major transformations do not happen because of a single invention, law, or event. They happen because thousands or even millions of small changes occur at the same time. A family changes its routine. A school changes its expectations. A company changes its hiring practices. Each adjustment may seem minor, but together they can reshape an entire society. The housewife era is one of the clearest examples of this process in modern history. Another reason the topic remains so fascinating is because it challenges simple assumptions about the past. Popular culture often presents the 1950s as either a perfect golden age or a period filled with limitations. In reality, it was both more ordinary and more complicated than those descriptions suggest. People laughed, worried, celebrated, argued, planned for the future, and faced everyday challenges just as they do today. The details were different, but the human experience was remarkably familiar. As historians interviewed women who lived through these decades, they frequently discovered stories that never appeared in advertisements or television programs. Some women quietly started businesses from their homes. Others volunteered in their communities, organised charitable projects, or became important leaders in local organisations. Many developed skills and talents that extended far beyond the traditional image of homemaking. These stories remind us that real lives are always richer and more complex than public stereotypes. The transformation also affected future generations in ways that were not immediately obvious. Children who grew up watching their mothers work often developed different expectations about education and careers. Those expectations influenced their own children, creating a chain reaction that continued for decades. Social change rarely ends with one generation. Instead, it echoes forward through families, schools, workplaces, and communities. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the story is how ordinary it feels. There are no dramatic battles, no famous speeches, and no single turning point that changed everything overnight. Instead, there are millions of personal decisions made by people who simply wanted better opportunities, greater stability, or more freedom to choose their own paths. Those decisions gradually transformed the nation from within. And that may be why the story of the American housewife continues to resonate today. It reminds us that history is not only something that happened long ago. History is happening right now, shaped by ordinary people making choices about work, family, education, and the future, just as previous generations unknowingly transformed their world. People today are shaping a future that historians have not yet begun to write about. By the beginning of the 21st century, many historians realized that the story of the American housewife was actually part of a much larger story about modern life itself. It was a story about how technology, education, economics, and culture interact with one another. When one part changes, everything else begins to shift as well. The washing machine changed household labour. Universities changed career opportunities. Economic pressures changed family structures. None of these developments existed in isolation. They were connected in ways that people living through the changes often could not fully see. One interesting observation made by researchers is that every generation tends to believe it is living in a unique and unprecedented time. Yet when they examine the past, they discover that earlier generations felt exactly the same way. The women of the 1950s believed they were building the future. The women of the 1980s believed they were building the future. People today believe the same thing. In reality, every generation is simply one link in a much longer chain of history. The story of the housewife era also highlights the importance of adaptation. The families that thrived were often those that adjusted to changing circumstances rather than resisting them completely. Some embraced new opportunities quickly. Others adapted more slowly. But over time, nearly everyone was affected by the broader transformations occurring around them. Change did not ask for permission. It arrived gradually through new technologies, economic developments, and cultural shifts. As we look back, it becomes clear the women at the centre of this story were far more influential than many people realised at the time. Through their choices about education, work, marriage, and family life, they helped redefine social expectations for future generations. Their decisions influenced not only their own lives, but also the opportunities available to their daughters and granddaughters. Few historical legacies are more powerful than that. Today, many of the debates that surrounded the decline of the traditional housewife continue in new forms. People still discuss work-life balance. They still debate childcare, career ambitions, and family responsibilities. The language may have changed, but the underlying questions remain familiar. How should people organise their lives? What responsibilities matter most? What does success really mean? These are questions every generation must answer for itself. Perhaps that is why this history continues to resonate. It is not simply about a role that faded away. It is about how societies evolve and how ordinary people respond to that evolution. The American housewife became one of the most recognisable figures of the 20th century. But her story ultimately teaches us something much larger. It teaches us that history is always moving, always changing, and always being shaped by people who rarely realise they are making history at all. In many ways, the story of the American housewife is also a story about expectations. Every society creates ideas about what a successful life should look like. These ideas influence how people think about work, marriage, education, and family. During the 1950s, the expectation for many women was clear. Build a home, raise children, support your husband, and contribute to your community. For millions of families, this model seemed natural because it matched the economic and cultural conditions of the time. But expectations can be powerful and limiting at the same time. They provide direction, yet they can also discourage alternative paths. As opportunities expanded in the second half of the 20th century, more women began exploring possibilities that earlier generations had rarely considered. Some pursued higher education. Others entered professions previously dominated by men. Many attempted to balance careers and family responsibilities simultaneously. These choices gradually broadened society's understanding of what women could accomplish. What makes this transformation remarkable is that it occurred during a period of rapid technological progress. New inventions changed how people communicated, travelled, shopped, and worked. Tasks that once required hours could suddenly be completed much faster. Information became easier to access. Entire industries emerged that had not existed only a few decades earlier. As the world became more complex, families adapted to new realities. Historians often note that social change is easiest to recognise when comparing generations. A grandmother, daughter, and granddaughter may each have grown up with completely different expectations about their futures. The grandmother may have expected marriage and homemaking. The daughter may have expected both family and a career. The granddaughter may have grown up believing she could choose from countless possibilities. These changing expectations reveal how dramatically society evolved within a relatively short period. Yet despite all these changes, some things remained constant. Families still cared about security, love, and opportunity. Parents still wanted the best for their children. Communities still relied on cooperation and support. The circumstances changed, but many of the underlying human goals remained the same. This continuity helps explain why the story continues to resonate. It combines dramatic social transformation with timeless human concerns. As we continue exploring this history, it becomes clear that the decline of the traditional American housewife was not simply the end of an era. It was part of an ongoing process through which societies redefine themselves. Every generation inherits traditions from the past and modifies them according to new realities. In doing so, they create a world that would have been difficult for their ancestors to imagine. The women who lived through this transformation played an essential role in shaping that future, leaving behind a legacy that extends far beyond the era in which they lived. The legacy of these changes can still be seen everywhere in modern society. Walk through a university campus, a hospital, a corporate office, or a government building, and you will find opportunities that were far less accessible to women only a few generations ago. Yet these opportunities did not appear suddenly. They were built gradually through decades of social change, personal determination, and shifting expectations. The women who challenged old assumptions often faced uncertainty because they were entering territory that previous generations had rarely explored. Their experiences helped create possibilities that later generations would come to take for granted. Historians sometimes compare this process to a relay race. One generation carries the baton for a while before passing it to the next. The women of the housewife era inherited a world shaped by their parents and grandparents. They then passed a different world to their children. Each generation contributed something new while preserving parts of what came before. This ongoing exchange between past and future is one of the forces that drives history forward. Another interesting aspect of the story is how memory shapes our understanding of the past. People often remember certain parts of an era more clearly than others. Some remember friendly neighbourhoods, family dinners, and community events. Others remember limited opportunities and strict social expectations. Neither perspective is entirely complete on its own. The reality contained both positive and negative elements, just as every historical period does. Understanding history requires looking beyond nostalgia and beyond criticism to appreciate the full complexity of human experiences. The story of the American housewife also demonstrates that social roles are never fixed forever. Roles that seem natural in one century may seem unusual in another. Future generations may one day look back at our own assumptions with the same curiosity that people today bring to the 1950s. They may wonder why families organised their lives in particular ways, or why certain expectations seemed so important. History teaches us that change is one of the few constants in human society. As researchers continue studying this period, they increasingly focus on individual stories rather than broad stereotypes. Every woman experienced the era differently. Some embraced traditional homemaking. Some pursued careers. Many moved between different roles throughout their lives. These personal stories reveal a richer and more accurate picture than any single image or cultural symbol ever could. Ultimately, the rise and decline of the American housewife, thus not merely about one social role fading away. It was about a society redefining itself in response to new realities. It was about families adapting to change while trying to preserve what mattered most to them. And it was about ordinary people making choices that, when combined with millions of others, quietly reshaped the course of modern American history. Perhaps the most important thing to remember is that history is never really about the past alone. The story of the American housewife helps us understand why modern families look the way they do today. It shows how economic changes, new technologies, and personal choices can gradually transform an entire society. The women who lived through this era were not trying to make history. They were simply making decisions about work, family, and the future. Yet those decisions influenced generations that followed. Their experiences remind us that ordinary people often have a greater impact on history than they realize. Every generation inherits a world shaped by those who came before, and then leaves its own mark for those who come after. The American housewife may belong to the past, but her story remains an important reminder of how quickly society can change. and how powerful everyday choices can be. And as we bring this chapter to a quiet close, the story of the American housewife leaves us with a simple lesson. No way of life stays exactly the same forever. Societies change, families adapt, and new generations create new possibilities. What once seemed like the permanent future eventually became part of history. Yet the values that mattered most, love, security, family, and hope for a better tomorrow, remained constant throughout every era. The women at the heart of this story helped shape modern America, not through famous speeches or dramatic events, but through countless everyday decisions. Their lives remind us that history is often made in ordinary homes by ordinary people, and that even the smallest choices can leave a legacy that lasts for generations. Of course, history never truly ends. Even after one chapter closes, its effects continue moving forward through future generations. The daughters and granddaughters of these women inherited a world shaped by their sacrifices, decisions, and determination. Many opportunities that seem ordinary today were built upon foundations laid decades earlier. Universities that once enrolled mostly men gradually welcomed more women. Workplaces that once restricted opportunities slowly opened their doors. Communities adapted to changing family structures. These developments did not happen overnight, nor were they inevitable. They were the result of countless individuals choosing to challenge old assumptions and explore new possibilities. Yet while the world changed dramatically, certain human experiences remained familiar. Parents still worried about their children. Families still searched for stability during uncertain times. People still hoped for meaningful work, loving relationships, and a better future. The details changed from one generation to another, but these basic desires connected people across decades. Looking back, it is easy to focus on the differences between the America of the 1950s and the America of today. But there are similarities as well. Both eras were filled with people trying to navigate a changing world. Both faced economic challenges, social debates, and uncertainty about the future. The individuals living through those times rarely knew how history would judge their decisions. They simply did their best with the circumstances they were given. That is what makes this story so relatable. It reminds us that history is not something distant or separate from everyday life. History is created by ordinary people making choices about work, family, education, and opportunity. The American housewife was one part of that larger story, a symbol of an era that helped shape modern society. Her world may belong to the past, but the lessons it offers remain surprisingly relevant. They remind us that change is constant, that expectations evolve, and that even the most ordinary lives can leave an extraordinary mark on the future. And perhaps that is the most comforting thought of all as we leave this chapter behind and continue our journey through history. As we reach the end of this journey, the story of the American housewife leaves us with more than facts about the past. It leaves us with a deeper understanding of how history quietly unfolds through everyday lives. The women at the centre of this story were not kings, presidents, or famous inventors. Most never expected their experiences to become part of a larger historical narrative. Yet through their daily routines, personal sacrifices, and important life decisions, they helped shape the direction of an entire nation. Their world was one of changing expectations, Some embraced the traditional role of homemaker and found meaning in building strong families and communities. Others dreamed of opportunities beyond the home and helped open doors for future generations. Many lived somewhere in between, balancing responsibilities, ambitions, and the realities of their time. Together, they reflected the complexity of real life, where choices are rarely simple and every path comes with both rewards and challenges. Today, the neighbourhoods, advertisements, and social expectations of the 1950s may feel distant, almost like scenes from another world. Yet the people who lived through that era were not so different from us. They worried about money. They cared about their children. They hoped for happiness and security. They wondered what the future would bring. In more ways, the questions they faced are the same questions people continue asking today. Perhaps that is why this story remains so meaningful. It reminds us that history is not just about major events or famous names. It is about ordinary people trying to build good lives in an ever-changing world. The rise and decline of the American housewife was not simply the story of one social role disappearing. It was the story of a society adapting to new realities, expanding opportunities, and redefining what was possible. And now, as this chapter gently comes to a close, we leave behind the quiet suburban streets, the family kitchens, and the lives of the women who helped shape modern America. Their era has passed, but their influence remains. Through the generations that followed, their choices continued to echo into the future. And so, with the lights dimming and the story complete, we can reflect on one final truth. History is never truly about the past. It is about people and the countless ways their lives continue to shape the world long after they are gone. Good night, and thank you for travelling through history with me.